You know, each year as the Easter season comes around, I find myself contemplating those matters, and something that comes up from time to time is a conversation that I had many years ago, which shook me out of my religious complacency and forced me to really look at what I actually believed about a lot of those things Brenda was just singing about. The conversation was between me and a Jewish doctor. He was my uncle by marriage, actually. He'd married one of my dad's 5 sisters, and they lived in Skokie, just outside of Chicago. And all of us lived in the same area, so we used to get together on regular occasions, and we had lots of good times together. We'd go back and forth to each other's homes for the various holidays, and I remember this conversation took place around the Christmas season. They had come over to visit my parents' house outside of Chicago. And my uncle, his name was Dave, he was talking about Christmas in our culture. And I mentioned that Dave was Jewish, he was a doctor, but he wasn't blatantly religious. It was really more of a cultural thing for him. And yet, he was a keen observer of human nature and very insightful when it came to matters of religion. And he was saying that from his perspective, from the perspective of a Jewish person observing our predominantly Christian culture, it seemed to him that Easter was the defining event in Christianity. And yet, guess which holiday gets all the hype and attention? Christmas. It's no contest. And he found this very puzzling. Very puzzling, again, in our Christian-dominated culture, that Christmas gets all the hype and Easter kind of falls by the wayside, even though it seems like the defining event. And I have to say that prior to that conversation, I'd never really given it a lot of thought before. Which just goes to show how valuable it is to make sure that we cultivate friendships with other people, have relatives who are from different religions and cultures to help us to be able to take another perspective, because that's what happened in this situation. And I remember thinking about it, and I said, well, you know, it's probably all about money. It's so easy for the surrounding culture to co-opt the Christian holiday of Christmas for profit, but Easter doesn't seem to work quite the same way. Christmas gets turned into this public spectacle with lots of secular trappings, while Easter remained primarily a private kind of observance. I mean, sure, Easter has its secular trappings, you know, bunnies and eggs and that kind of stuff, but it's nowhere near as extensive or overwhelming as Christmas. And as I said earlier, it forced me to examine my beliefs. And I wondered, would there be any kind of Christianity today without the events of Easter? What would it look like? The idea of a dying and rising God who would come back to rescue the believers, that was the driving force behind the spread of Christianity as a world religion. So I figured, hey, no resurrection, no Christianity, right? Without the resurrection, the story would have ended, shall we say, rather abruptly, right? They arrested him, they executed him, they buried him, he disappeared. Story over, nothing more to see here, move along, that kind of thing. So, at the time of this conversation, I was still what you might call a nominal Christian. I had long since stopped believing in the supernatural elements of both the Christmas and the Easter stories. And so, for the first time in my life, I started to question whether that rendered the life and teachings of Jesus meaningless. Take away the flashy stuff, take away the supernatural stuff, take away the virgin birth, the miracles, the resurrection. What was left? What happens when we try to separate the man from the myth? And I think the first thing we have to address here is whether there was really any man at all. because it's becoming increasingly popular in certain circles, atheist, secular, and even New Age circles, to argue that there was no historical Jesus. I've noticed in the New Age movement that there's this idea going around that Jesus was nothing more than a fictional character who was cobbled together from a combination of stories about the different avatars, gods, ascended masters, and masters of Gnostic lore and things like this that were appropriated or stolen from other cultures. A lot of these people are graduates of what I've heard called the University of Google. No real scholarship or research, just a lot of credulous internet surfing, which then qualifies them to write a book or make a movie on the subject. And one of their favorite arguments that you're going to hear, if you haven't already, is that the key events in the life of Jesus are identical to those of other mythical figures like Horus, Mithra, Krishna, Dionysus, and therefore Jesus is nothing more than a myth as well. Now, it will take more time than we have here this morning to dismantle those claims, but I assure you that they can be totally and convincingly demolished. I've provided a source in your handout. It's a book by an author whose work I respect greatly. The book is called Did Jesus Exist? By Bart Ehrman, who I consider to be a reliable and objective and extremely well-qualified author. He is a PhD historian and Bible scholar who is currently the chair of religious studies at the University of North Carolina. Has a very interesting background. He started out as a Christian fundamentalist. He graduated from Wheaton College, which is about as conservative Christian as you can get. That was right in my backyard, back where I used to live in Downers Grove in St. Charles, Illinois. But after college, the deeper he got into his graduate school education, the more doubts he started to have, especially when he began working with things that they call primary source materials, ancient Greek texts and things like that. He now describes himself as an agnostic. And I think it would be safe to say that he has no agenda one way or the other, either to prove that Jesus never existed or to prove that he did exist. If they were to prove conclusively that Jesus didn't exist, he would have no problem with it, but it would have to be based on convincing evidence, because he is a historian after all. So when Dr. Ehrman reviews all of the evidence, including all the stuff about Horus and Mithra and so on and so forth, he concludes that Jesus was a real person in history. That doesn't mean that you have to accept all of the supernatural elements as historical facts, and that's really a key distinction here. Just because there are mythical elements added to a story about someone doesn't make that someone non-historical or non-existent. Did Jesus really walk on water? Did George Washington really chop down a cherry tree? Was Walt Disney frozen after he died? Did Brian Williams get forced down in a helicopter over Iraq under enemy fire? Tall tales, embellishments, and even false memories are commonplace. They are a part of the human condition. It's part of our human nature to want to embellish and augment the stories of those that we admire. None of those things that I just mentioned really happened, but the people are still real. When it comes to Jesus, the most common complaint that I hear is that the evidence is mostly circumstantial. So what? I have a law degree, and I'm here to tell you that you can prove a case based entirely on circumstantial evidence. I spent 20 years as a trial lawyer. I've done it. And if I were arguing the case for a historical Jesus, the first thing I would point out is that if people were going to get together and create a mythical Jesus, or let's call him a mythical superhero out of whole cloth, wouldn't you think that they'd get their story straight? Instead, we have 4 or more different gospels written at different times in history with some really big discrepancies. If you're going to write a work of fiction, you want to get on the same page, which tells me that people are remembering real events in different ways, through different filters, at different times. If you were going to create a work of fiction about a mythical superhero, would you make him an illegitimate child? An illegitimate child from a disreputable town like Nazareth. Because when you read the Gospel of John, there's this story of Philip and Nathanael. And Philip is telling Nathanael about this amazing rabbi named Jesus, who was the son of Joseph from Nazareth. And Nathanael says to him, "Oh, big deal. Can anything good possibly come out of Nazareth?" It was not held in good repute, at least at the time that John was written. Superheroes live in places like Metropolis, right? Or Gotham City, not Nazareth. Another thing that doesn't happen to mythical superheroes, they don't make predictions that don't come true. Look in the Gospels sometimes. Jesus is quoted as saying that the generation of people that he was speaking to at the time would be witnesses to the Son of Man coming in clouds with power and glory. Well, that generation has passed away, along with hundreds more, and nothing like that kind of power and glory has happened. In fact, quite the opposite happened. The Holy Temple in Jerusalem was laid waste by the Roman army. The Jewish people were dispersed to the 4 corners of the earth. This isn't a story that people were making up about a person who never existed. These are people trying to make sense of something that didn't seem to make sense. If that makes any sense. For me, the most convincing evidence of Jesus as a historical being is in the writings of Paul. Now, unlike Jesus, there are not many people who question the existence of Paul, unless you're inclined to believe that the moon landings were a hoax and the earth is still flat or things like this. But Paul was a Pharisee. He was a conservative Jewish fundamentalist. That's what that essentially is. And in one of his authentic letters that he wrote to the community at Galatia, the letter called Galatians, he admits and kind of brags about the fact that he had persecuted the church of Jesus and its followers and had tried to destroy it. So Paul was this real-life villain. He was a real-life villain in the days of the early followers of Jesus, and then look what happens to him. He goes from being a persecutor and an oppressor to an advocate virtually overnight. So what happened to Paul would be a lot like Pat Robertson. You know who he is? It would be a lot like Pat Robertson going on a worldwide speaking tour promoting marriage equality, right? That is the kind of day and night transformation that we see with him. Now Paul never actually claimed that he got to hang out with Jesus. And there's no evidence that he did. But he did spend a lot of time with Peter and James, who was the brother of Jesus, and other apostles. And they didn't get along all that well. They got into some big arguments about matters of doctrine and practice and things like this. And the other thing about Paul is that his letters are older than any of the Gospels, by a lot. Paul was much closer to the sources. So by the time the Gospel of John gets written down, and that was the latest one, by the time the Gospel of John is written down, the apostles are dead, Paul is dead, and yet the life and teachings of Jesus were so inspiring and compelling to people that they were still recording stories. So, we flash forward to today. And as I look around this country, I've noticed that the people who insist loudly and repeatedly that this is a Christian nation, I've noticed that they don't seem to use Jesus as a role model for ethical living. Those who insist that this is a Christian nation and that Jesus definitely really existed don't seem to use him as a role model for ethical living, which means that he may as well be a myth. As far as what they're doing, he may as well be a myth based on how people seem to ignore his core teachings on things like unconditional love, loving your enemies, nonviolence, tolerance, wealth, materialism, and so on and so forth. In fact, just yesterday during my morning reading, I came across an article that had just been posted by a fellow named Benjamin Corey. He calls himself a former Christian fundamentalist, and it's an interesting article. Yeah, well, formerly fundy is what he calls his blog. He's quite well qualified. He made a couple of observations. He was observing that there are two different types of Christianity. Two different types of Christianity. One is a movement of people who want to live and be like Jesus. Okay, the other one, which he says is far more common and powerful, is a nationalistic and political religion that is simply named Christianity. The civil political religion named Christianity is addicted to both political power and violence, both of which would have been deeply offensive to the historical Jesus, the way he lived and the things that he actually taught. I thought that was a very interesting observation. I haven't heard it put that trenchantly before. I prefer, personally speaking, I prefer the movement of people like Unity who want to live and be like Jesus and maybe don't really care if he actually walked on water, rose from the dead, or went whooshing off to heaven on a cloud. I also prefer the movement of people like Unity who want to learn and benefit from the lives and teachings of other great historical figures like the Buddha, the Greek philosophers, and many others. However, this is the Easter season, and we're going to continue to focus on Jesus for the next few weeks because there's a lot here to unpack about the life teachings and the great example of this very interesting person. We're going to pick up with that next week, and once again today after the service, probably starting around, maybe 11:30-ish, we'll be meeting in the youth ed area. If anyone wants to come on in, we will talk about today's topic. If you have any questions or comments or complaints, we can sit down and talk about it. So I hope to see some of you there, and we'll see the rest of you right next door in Manning Hall, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.